The night is dark, but the fire is warm, and there is safety in the light. Welcome back to the circle, travelers. Pull your cloaks tight against the chill, and let the crackle of these coals steady your spirit. When we last spoke, we watched the sky fall. Princess Schala, stripped of her home and her magic, was cast adrift in the howling currents of time. We saw her wake in the damp mud of an ancient, unforgiving wilderness, haunted by the ghostly vision of a fortress she's destined to raise with her own two hands. Tonight, the true weight of her exile begins. We follow the Princess of Zeal as she steps down from that lonely overlook and into the brutal reality of a primitive world. It's a land of iron and mud, of petty warlords and desperate survival. A place where a girl wearing ruined silk must learn to walk without the safety of the heavens, laying the first stones of a kingdom that'll stand for a millennium. Before we step back into those ancient woods, I ask that you tend to our fellowship. If you find peace by this fire, leave your mark upon the journey. Hit the like button, subscribe to our gathering, and ring the notification bell. It keeps the wood piled high and ensures you'll never miss a tale when the fire is lit. Now, settle in. The shadows are stretching long, and the story's waiting to be told. The phantom spires of the fortress dissolved into the mist, leaving Schala alone on the jagged promontory. The silence of the ancient world rushed back in, broken only by the distant, indifferent roar of the river cutting through the canyon below. The vision of that future stronghold, a place she knew in her bones but had never seen with her eyes, faded, leaving behind a profound and hollow ache. There was no sanctuary here. There was only the wind, the stone, and the vast, terrifying expanse of the wild. She turned away from the overlook, her body trembling with an exhaustion that went far deeper than bone and muscle. It was the exhaustion of a soul that had been violently uprooted from its soil. In the floating kingdom, the environment yielded to the will of the enlightened. The climate was a perpetual golden spring. The air was purified by elemental arrays. The paths were paved in smooth, flawless marble. Here, the earth made no concessions. Schala began the descent into the canyon, and within the first 100 yards, the brutal reality of the surface world began to exact its toll. Her footwear, delicate slippers of woven sky silk designed for pacing the polished halls of palaces, offered no protection against the jagged shale and gnarly exposed roots of the ridge. With every step, the sharp stones bit into the soles of her feet. The thorny underbrush, thick and greedy, caught at her heavy robes, tearing the fine fabric and leaving long, stinging scratches across her pale skin. She slipped. The damp earth gave way beneath her heel, and she tumbled down a steep embankment, crashing through a thicket of sharp-leaved ferns before coming to a hard, bruised halt against the mossy trunk of a massive oak. She lay there in the dirt, the breath knocked from her lungs, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth from a bitten lip. For a long moment, she didn't get up. The urge to simply close her eyes and let the dark green shadows consume her was overwhelmingly strong. But then, the image of Janus flashed in her mind, his small, terrified face, his hands clutching at his head, lost somewhere in this endless, savage wilderness. "Janus," she whispered into the damp loam. The name was a prayer, an anchor, a curse. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. Her hands were caked in dark mud, her royal garments ruined, stained green and brown. She forced herself to keep moving, picking her way down the treacherous slope until the sound of the river grew from a distant roar to a deafening rush. When she finally broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the rocky bank, the sight of the water made her drop to her knees. In her home, water was a gentle, controlled element, dancing in anti-gravity fountains or flowing in heated, scented bathing pools. This river was a violent, untamed thing. It surged over massive boulders, churning white and angry, cold as the ice age that had only recently retreated from this land. Schala crawled to the water's edge. She cupped her trembling hands and brought the freezing water to her lips. The shock of the cold was like a physical blow against her teeth. It tasted of crushed stone, of deep earth, of raw minerals, a stark, heavy flavor that possessed none of the refined, ether-infused sweetness she was accustomed to. She drank greedily, the frigid water charging her system with a harsh, jolting energy. But quenching her thirst awakened a new, far more persistent demon: hunger. In the high palaces, biology was an afterthought. The ambient magical field sustained the enlightened, supplementing their physical needs so that meals were matters of pleasure and social ritual, not survival. Here, the magical field was dead. Schala's body, suddenly forced to run entirely on its own mortal engines, began to cannibalize itself. A hollow, gnawing pain blossomed in her stomach, sharp and demanding. She looked around the riverbank. There were bushes heavy with dark berries, and strange bulbous fungi clinging to the rotting logs, but the great libraries of antiquity had not taught her how to forage. She did not know which leaves were medicine and which were poison. She was a scholar of elemental resonance, a master of Dreamstone conductivity, and in this primitive forest, all of her staggering intellect was rendered utterly useless. The sun began to dip below the heavy canopy, and the temperature plummeted. The pale light of the afternoon gave way to long, stretching shadows that seemed to crawl across the forest floor. With the dark came the sounds. The ancient woods did not sleep. They merely changed their guard. High above, unseen winged predators let out sharp, piercing shrieks that echoed through the canyon. In the brush, heavy paws snapped dry twigs. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the earth, a sound so deep it bypassed the ears and rattled directly against the ribs. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Schala. She realized with paralyzing clarity that she was prey. She scrambled away from the exposed riverbank, retreating into the dense cover of the trees. She found a massive, ancient cedar whose roots had heaved out of the ground, forming a shallow, dirt-walled hollow beneath the trunk. She crawled into the cramped space, pulling her torn robes tight around her shoulders and curled into a tight ball. That first night was a slow, torturous eternity. She did not sleep. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, sent spikes of adrenaline through her exhausted heart. The cold seeped into her bones, a damp, pervasive chill that made her teeth chatter uncontrollably. She clutched the inert Dreamstone pendant at her throat, desperately trying to draw some warmth, some comfort from it, but the ruby was as cold as the earth she lay upon. She spent the night with her eyes wide open, staring into the pitch-black woods, praying to a sky that could no longer hear her for the safety of her brother. When the pale gray light of dawn finally broke the darkness, Schala crawled out of her hollow. She was stiff, bruised, and shivering. Her stomach cramped violently, but the rising of the sun brought a grim, unyielding resolve. If she stayed hidden, she would die. If she died, Janice would be truly alone. For 3 days, the Princess of the Sky walked the earth. She learned, through brutal trial and error, how to navigate the terrain. She learned to use a sturdy branch as a walking stick to test the depth of the mud and brace herself against the steep inclines. She learned to follow the tracks of the small-hoofed animals to find patches of edible bitter greens, watching what they ate before daring to chew the fibrous leaves herself. It was barely enough to keep the starvation at bay, leaving her with a constant, dizzying lightheadedness. Her appearance transformed. The radiant, ethereal beauty of the royal court was buried under a mask of survival. Her long, pale blue hair, once brushed to a silken shine by handmaidens, was now a tangled, matted mane, thick with burrs and dried mud. Her skin, once flawless, was smeared with dirt and covered in insect bites and scratches. The ruined remnants of her silk dress hung around her, like the tattered sails of a ghost ship. If the queen could have seen her daughter now, she would not have recognized her. On the afternoon of the 4th day, The endless monotony of the wild broke. Schala was moving along a high ridge when she smelled it. It was faint, carried on an updraft of wind, but it was unmistakable. Wood smoke. It wasn't the sweet, perfumed incense that burned in the braziers of her home. It was the sharp, acrid scent of green wood and the heavy, greasy aroma of roasting meat. It was the smell of humanity. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Humanity meant civilization. Civilization meant a camp, a settlement, people who might have seen a frightened boy with dark hair and pointed ears. She pushed her exhausted body to move faster, following the scent through the dense foliage. The trees began to thin, giving way to an area that had been cleared by hand. Stumps dotted the landscape, the wood hacked away by crude, blunt instruments. She followed a rutted, muddy track that had been worn into the earth by the passage of many feet and the dragging of heavy loads. Schala crept to the edge of the tree line, staying low behind a thick cluster of ferns, and peered out into a wide, shallow basin. Below her lay a settlement. It was a jagged, ugly scar upon the landscape. A crude palisade wall, made of sharpened logs lashed together with coarse rope, surrounded a cluster of perhaps 20 dwellings. The houses were round, built of wattle and daub. Woven branches slapped thick with mud and clay and topped with conical roofs of dried thatch. Smoke drifted lazily from holes in the center of the roofs, hanging low over the village in the damp air. This was not the Enlightenment. These were the earthbound, but an iteration of them so ancient, so disconnected from the magic of the world, that they barely resembled the scholars and workers she had known. Schala watched the village for hours, her desperate hopes slowly cooling into a deep, cautious dread. The people who moved between the mud huts were clad in rough-spun, undyed wool and heavy animal hides. They were lean, their faces weathered and lined by the constant, brutal elements. They moved with a slow, weary deliberation, carrying baskets of roots, bundles of firewood, or buckets of water sloshing with the river's silt. There was no joy in this place. There was no art, no music, no philosophy. There was only the grim, unceasing mechanics of staying alive for one more day. As the afternoon dragged on, the true nature of this primitive society revealed itself. A commotion arose near the heavy timber gates of the palisade. The villagers stopped their work, their heads bowing low, their posture shrinking with a collective practiced subservience. A group of men rode into the village on horseback. The beasts were shaggy and ill-tempered, and the men who rode them were worse. They were larger than the villagers, better fed, and wrapped in thicker furs. But it was the iron that marked them. They carried heavy, crude swords and spears tipped with dark metal. These were not protectors. They were predators who had realized that farming peasants was easier than hunting deer. The leader of the riders, a massive man with a beard braided with bone beads, barked an order. His men dismounted and began to move through the village. They weren't collecting taxes, they were pillaging. They kicked over baskets, inspected the drying meat racks, and took whatever pleased them. A villager, an older man with a desperate look in his eyes, tried to hold onto a woven sack of grain. One of the armed men didn't hesitate. He struck the old man across the face with the heavy wooden haft of his spear, sending him crumpling into the mud. No one moved to help him. The other villagers simply looked away, their faces blank masks of submission, waiting for the storm to pass. This was the law of the land. It was a world entirely devoid of justice, governed only by the brutal mathematics of strength and violence. From her hiding place in the ferns, Schala felt a cold sickness settle in her stomach. Her initial instinct, the desperate urge to run down the hill, throw herself at their mercy, and beg for their help in finding Janice, evaporated. She looked down at her own ruined hands, at the tattered silk of her royal robes, at the heavy Dreamstone pendant resting against her chest. She was a ghost from a world that had not yet been born, and she was utterly defenseless. If she walked into that village, she would not find allies. To the weary, paranoid peasants, she would look like a witch or a madwoman, a creature to be feared and driven away with stones. To the warlord and his men, she would look like prey. They would not see a princess of the sky. They would see a strange prize, a captive to be claimed, broken and used. The heavy silver and the massive ruby of her pendant alone would be enough to get her killed in a world where men murdered each other over sacks of grain. She could not ask these people for help. She could not expose herself to the brutality of this era. Schala slowly backed away from the tree line, retreating into the deeper shadows of the forest before the armed men could cast their gaze toward the ridge. She found a small, sheltered alcove between three massive boulders and sat down, pulling her knees to her chest. The physical hunger gnawing at her belly was suddenly eclipsed by a much heavier, darker weight. It was the weight of the search. Before, the wilderness had been a terrifying obstacle, but it was an empty one. Now, she understood the true nature of the world she had fallen into. It was a sprawling, fractured landscape of isolated hamlets and petty, violent kings. A world where strangers were met with the edge of a sword, and where a vulnerable child wandering alone would not be met with compassion, but with exploitation or death. Where was Giannis in this vast, cruel expanse? Was he shivering in the roots of a tree, crying for a mother who had tried to obliterate him? Had he been found by men like the one she had just seen? The thought made her breath catch in her throat, a sharp, physical pain strike in her chest. He was so small, so sensitive, his mind already bruised by the dark pressure of the Mammon machine. He wouldn't survive the cruelty of these iron-wielding warlords. He wouldn't understand their violence. "I have to find him," she whispered to the silent stones. "I have to find him before they do." But the sheer scale of the task pressed down on her like the crushing depths of the ocean. The land was endless. The forests stretched for hundreds of miles, broken only by treacherous rivers, jagged mountains, and the occasional hostile settlement. She had no magic to track him. She had no scrying pools, no elemental resonance to guide her. She had only her own 2 feet, a body that was rapidly failing from malnutrition, and a world that wanted her dead. She closed her eyes, and the darkness behind her eyelids immediately filled with the memory of the chronal stream. She saw the blinding flash of her mother's spell, the shattering of the deep chamber, and a terrifying silent fall through the void. But most vividly she felt the phantom sensation of Janice's fingers slipping from her grasp, the tragic, inevitable slide of his hand as the currents of time tore them apart. A single tear cut a clean track through the dirt on her cheek, falling to strike the cold surface of the Dreamstone pendant. The despair was a living thing, a cold, heavy serpent coiling around her heart, whispering that it was impossible, whispering that the boy was already gone, scattered to some other distant, unreachable shore of time, and that her wandering was nothing but a slow, agonizing prelude to her own death in the mud. Schala opened her eyes. The forest was growing dark again. Another night was coming, bringing the cold and the unseen predators. She tightened her grip on the walking stick she had fashioned from a fallen branch. She used it to leverage herself up, her legs shaking with the effort of standing. The despair was heavy, threatening to drag her back down to the earth, but she refused to let it anchor her. The compassion that had defined her existence in the floating kingdom had not been burned away by the fall. It had simply hardened into a desperate, unyielding resolve. She didn't know which direction to go. She didn't know how she would survive another week without food. She didn't know how to navigate the brutal politics of the primitive warlords. But as she stepped out of the boulders and back into the deepening shadows of the ancient woods, she knew only one thing with absolute, undeniable certainty. She would not stop walking. She would turn over every stone, brave every dark forest, and walk the length of this savage, broken world until her legs gave out or she found her brother. The sky was gone. but the long, dark road was just beginning. The embers are burning low, travelers, and the shadows of the ancient woods are creeping back to reclaim the night. We will leave Princess Schala here for now, walking steadily into the dark, armed with nothing but a ruined silk dress and an unbreakable resolve. Her journey has only just begun. Out there in the primitive unknown, the heavy stones of history are waiting to be moved, and the foundations of a kingdom are waiting to be laid. Do not miss the next chapter of Princess Schala's tale, arriving this Tuesday, as we follow her deeper into the unforgiving wilds of a world before time. Until then, thank you for sitting by the fire and sharing in the lore. May your own paths be safe, may your burdens be light, and may your dreams be sheltered from the cold. Farewell, travelers, and good night.